Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Learning Success podcast. And today we have Merriam Saunders with us. Let me tell you a little bit about Merriam. Merriam is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She has specialized training in ADHD and autism. She has specialized training in coaching for ADHD. She is an adjunct professor in the counseling psychology graduate program at the Dominican University. She is a certified mediator and has worked for Marin County Office of Education as a special education mediator. She's a panelist for Marin County Family Court's case settlement conferences, and she is a published children's book author with a book titled My Whirling, Twirling Motor, and I believe one coming out called My Wandering Dreaming Mind. She uses mindfulness training, cognitive behavioral interventions, communication and behavioral modification training to positively help empower clients to uncover their strengths and solve their greatest struggles. She is a mom of 3 teens, 2 with ADHD and 1 with auditory processing disorder and anxiety. Hello, Merriam.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here today.
Welcome. We're really glad to have you. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice to start off with?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you mentioned, I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I work almost exclusively with parents that have children with ADHD and or autism. And I came about specializing in those 2 things in particular because I have children who struggle with those issues myself. So it seemed like a natural progression.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I have worked with children directly in the past. At this stage, though, I'm focusing more on working directly with parents because I feel that that's really where we see the most impact.
Yeah, I can absolutely agree with that. I think that the parents' reactions to it and their emotions have so much to do with it. So that actually leads us right into one of the first questions in your book. Am I correct in saying that the first book is obviously out, My Whirling, Twirling Motor, and is the second book out, or is that coming out?
No, second book is not out yet. It will
Okay.
be out within the year. The illustrator is working on the drawings as we speak, I believe.
Okay, fantastic. That'll be exciting. Good. So, so you talk about the wonderful list, and this is something we actually we call it catching in the act. But can you explain how the wonderful list is what it is and how it's helpful for guiding behavior?
Yeah, so I conceived of the story because this is one of the first interventions that I ask my clients to do when they come to meet with me. Because children with ADHD specifically, and most frequently children with the hyperactive presentation of ADHD are, they usually spend their days being told everything that they've done wrong,
Right.
which over time has a drastic impact on a child's self-esteem because ADHD is an impulse control disorder if they have the hyperactive kind. And oftentimes these poor children find themselves behaving in ways that they weren't even able to control and happens before they, even knew that they had done what they did. So to be told that you're constantly doing something wrong when it's outside of your control is really detrimental to your self-esteem. And so I have parents write what we call a wonderful list, which is, grab a notebook or use your iPhone and try to, how you call it, catch your kids doing something right. And we find that they do things right all day. They might not be spectacular. They're not, solving world peace or anything, but they're picking up their socks or they're bringing a plate, from the table to the sink without being told. Little tiny things that they do right. And not only does it help then to read that list to them at the end of the day, but it also helps to reframe the way we look at our children as parents. Because when we're so focused on the negative, it doesn't feel good. It's not joyful parenting.
Right. And framing is really everything. And of course, the quote, what we focus on, it grows, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we used to use, I was 20 years as a Kung Fu instructor. And so we would have a real big mix of children with ADHD. Early on in my career, we had a elementary school principal who brought his daughter in and saw what we did. And then he sent us, I think, every ADHD kid in his entire school to our classes. And along with that, he sent us his dyslexics and his dyscalculics and his dysgraphia and everything. So we had quite a testing ground and figuring things out. But one of the things we would do is use the wonderful list theory, and at the same time a lot for a kid with learned helplessness, and that comes up a lot. And we could use a kid who might be the class clown on one hand, who was trying to get attention, and the one with learned helplessness who was trying to just be absorbed into the background and not noticed.
Right.
And we would just look for the tiniest thing from the kid with learned helplessness to get their behavior changed to where they would try hard, because they wouldn't try at all. And then at the same time, we were ignoring the kid who was acting out. And so then finally, when we could compliment the one with the learned helplessness and do that over and over until you just have to find the tiniest thing, and they almost didn't believe that they did something right. And so we could control the whole class and bring them by that methodology. So I really love what you do. And then we would teach the parents how to do the same. So that also brings into the concept of something else we would do called what I'm good at, and the idea that self-confidence and self-esteem are transferable from one activity to another. And this comes up in Amy Cuddy's book. She talks about having a list of things that a child is good at, and then if they come into something that they're not good at, then going through that list of what they're good at to raise confidence. Can you speak about that and raising confidence?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if you, even as adults, right, if you can achieve mastery or a sense of agency in one area, it's such an empowering feeling to know that, oh, okay, I could do that. It's probably, now I have this positive experience that I can transfer to something else. I know what it takes. I know that it's not just going to come automatically. I have to work hard at it. I have to practice, and then eventually I can achieve this sense of the thing. So yeah, if you have a child who's never experienced or told that they, either in the learned helplessness child have a sense of agency, or in the child who's always acting out and being told what they're doing wrong, that they actually do things right, then how can they transfer that across and generalize it to other parts of their life?
Right. You use the word mastery. I'm a big believer in that, in mastering anything, just to learn the process, and then that gives you the confidence that you can master something else.
Right. And it doesn't, when we speak of mastery, it doesn't have to be like, oh, I've become a black belt, or I've achieved this great thing. It really is just mastering a certain behavior. It could be mastering brushing your teeth correctly, or, a bedtime routine, or it doesn't have to be this huge, impossible task.
Right. And actually a question that I have later, I'll go ahead and jump to that, is that the idea, so you mentioned, dopamine, and that children with ADHD may be lacking dopamine. And so we use the concept of Kaizen, which means just breaking things down into tiny things. And so that every time that you master that tiny task, you're getting that little spurt of dopamine. Can you speak about that, about how small that mastery, and is that a technique you would use to build confidence?
Right. It absolutely all ties together, from this sense of mastery and something like the wonderful list, and getting these hits of praise, because dopamine is what stimulates the area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is where the higher level thinking takes place. It's where you organize and plan and remember things. It controls your sense of time and inhibition control. And if you don't have enough gas powering that part of your motor, it's not going to work properly, right? It's just so.
Mhm.
Studies have shown we've done brain scans in children with ADHD, particularly, that shows that part of the brain is actually on average 3 years behind in development,
Mhm.
and that it's also not getting as much dopamine to it. So it's just not getting stimulated enough. So when you add something like praise, which increases dopamine, because dopamine is the pleasure neurotransmitter, if you will.
Sure.
It's the one that gets created when we're happy or we're experiencing something we love or someone's praising us. So if you get praise or you have that sense of accomplishment and it creates joy, that will create dopamine, which will then allow the prefrontal cortex to achieve even at a higher level.
Right, right. Yeah, and I've read a study where that aha moment of learning is a dopamine, but is dopamine being excreted. But it doesn't matter the size of the learning. It doesn't matter the size of the win.
Right,
Right,
exactly. So to your earlier point, right, even the smallest
the smallest. Right.
sense of achievement of, I did one more problem on the worksheet than I did
Yeah,
yesterday,
yeah.
can give that little dopamine hit.
So, uh, tell me about. I've also heard you use the phrase to fill the self-esteem bucket. I think I'm quoting you on that. Um, so, is tell me about self-confidence and self-esteem as I kind of feel that that is a prerequisite for being a good learner. Do you, how do you think self-confidence and self-esteem affects just the way the brain functions as being a good learner?
Right, I think if you have been told over and over again that you do things wrong and that and your own personal experience is that you struggle at something and you just can't seem to get it done as easily as, Johnny who sits next to you in math class, then it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that you start to believe that yourself. Well, I'm just no good at this. And if I believe I'm no good at this, then what's the point in trying? Because I'm not really ever going to accomplish it anyway, whether it's learning to play soccer or learning your multiplication table.
Sure. So, of course, now if they want to avoid that, would that lead into some negative behaviors? Would they use that?
Usually, yeah, yeah, usually, especially in the sense of in a case of hyperactive ADHD,
Hmm.
because they tend to be more noticeable. Inattentive ADHD, is quiet in the back of the classroom, often goes undiagnosed for a while.
Okay.
Um, with the hyperactive children, they're the quote unquote troublemakers. They're the ones who are constantly being told, "Don't touch that. Quiet down. It's not talking time. Don't talk out of turn." And they're not finishing their work. They're forgetting it at home. And so if they reach the point where they feel like, well, I'm no good at this anyway, no matter how hard I try, I'm still doing it wrong. So what's the point? Then that's who they feel they are. And they will probably, start to elevate those behaviors because that's who they are, right? That's who everybody thinks I am. I can get a laugh at least if I goof off
Right.
in class. So maybe I'll
Right.
try that approach. Get the, dopamine hit off the laughter from my classmates, even though I know it's going to get me in trouble.
That makes perfect sense. Right. Right. Um, so the inattentive. You mentioned the inattentive ADHD would be more the wallflower. Um,
Yes, yeah, absolutely. They don't have the hyperactive piece, or they don't have the impulse control piece. So they tend not to be children that act out. They are the children that will seem to be daydreaming in class, will forget things at home a lot, or forget where they put things. And but because they're not acting out, they're not troublemakers, they often don't get, they're not the squeaky wheel, so they often don't get the grease until, grades really start deteriorating. Maybe this is a child that's not learning to read as quickly, or doesn't turn homework in all the time, and so grades start getting impacted.
So that's when it gets noticed. There's no other real common indicators that people would notice.
No, because there aren't typically the behavior issues, right? So, and there isn't really homework. Well, there shouldn't be anyway, in kindergarten, first grade, second grade.
Right.
So when we start to expect higher reasoning, when you start to read to learn instead of learning to read in third grade, that might be when, what's going on with this child? Starts to become a little more noticeable. Percentage-wise, also ADHD, inattentive type, tends to be diagnosed more in girls. Of course, it's not exclusive.
So I actually, that leads me to something interesting. I just recently, we have an online dyslexia screener. And I took the data from that screener and just did a really deep dive into that data. And I found quite a few interesting things, but one of the interesting things that I just was really baffling to me was that I found that these are parents taking the screener for the child and just filling in. And I found that the boys that were the screener was being taken for, the median age that was between 5 and 7, maybe 5 and 8. The girls was between 14 and 16.
Wow.
And these are girls that are having problems in reading. So whether it's dyslexia or possibly the inattentive ADHD, I don't know if there's a relationship here. But that just really, that stands out to me, that this inattentive ADHD would not get noticed.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm not all that surprised, I think, because girls have a tendency to be, I hate to stereotype across the board, but right, it's just that frequently girls might have a tendency to be more people pleasers and will just push through and try to go unnoticed and just do what they have to do, and so they might not. And there could be a correlation between inattentive ADHD and
yeah, that's I mean, everybody I've spoken to has had the same thing, that girls typically are higher on the agreeableness scale, and so therefore would go and then they'll use, I've had girls in my class, and the way they'll avoid things is being cute. And it works. It worked, and so they can divert your attention from problems in a way that they can be pretty skilled at it, actually.
Yeah.
So it's amazing the coping factors that are developed, right?
Right.
Yeah. So if a child is really, really struggling, and then they're starting to either show extreme lack of self-confidence or self-esteem, or a lot of negative behaviors, should a parent back off of the academics at that point until something is resolved? I see a lot of kids that just get pushed harder into more academics when that may be causing some more problems.
Yeah, I am a big proponent in the parental backing off, especially when the children are in elementary school and even up to 8th grade, provided you're not trying to get your child into a private school, because no one is ever going to see those grades.
Right.
The grades don't matter at all. But what really does matter is that your child is learning how to learn, has a joy for learning, and feels that learning is something they can accomplish. And if you are, having to sit down with your child and strong arm them into getting their homework done, then wouldn't it be better to figure out what's the underlying issue here? How can we tackle that? Give the child the support they need so that they will have the possibility of being more successful later in their academic career. But continuing to ask of them what's asked of a neurotypical learner or a learner without a learning disability, as if they have no struggle, is just frustrating for them. And who would want to continue doing that? I wouldn't. I would shut down.
Sure.
The other piece that's important to remember too, especially early on, is that if you at home are having to help your child that much, where you have to sit next to them and essentially, do their homework for or with them to the degree that they can't do it independently, then you're robbing the school of the opportunity to understand what's going on with this child, because all the teacher sees is, all right, something unusual is happening in my class, but gosh, this child manages to get their homework done perfectly well and all the answers are correct.
Right.
And then the parent gets upset because the school won't give them the help that they feel they need. So I often will consult with parents and say, I know this is going to be difficult, but you need to let your child fail right now.
I can see now why you counsel the parents. This is making a lot of sense. Yeah. What are the symptoms of ADHD?
Well, there are 18 different symptoms, so we can't list them all. But
Okay.
you know, as we mentioned before, there are actually 3 different types. There's hyperactive, inattentive, and combined type. And you just need a minimum of 6 in order to meet the criteria for the diagnosis. It does have to be diagnosed before the age of 12, or the symptoms at least. I'm sorry, it doesn't have to be diagnosed, but the symptoms need to have appeared before the age of 12. And it does.
Why is that?
Well, I guess you'd have to ask the the DSM-5,
Okay,
which
that's
is
the definition. Gotcha. Okay. Right.
that's the diagnostic manual that we use. But they
Okay.
determine it used to be earlier, and it used to be 7. And
Uh-huh.
in the latest revision of the manual, they increased it to 12, which would capture a lot more children that might have that. And you can diagnose it as an adult, absolutely, if that adult can reference recalling having had those symptoms before the age of 12.
I see.
Mm.
Okay. Great.
And the other thing is that a level of impairment has to occur in 2 different settings. So if you have a child who's an angel in school and just you know, awful at home, that child does not have ADHD, because it's not something that can be controlled. So if they can control it in one setting and not the other, then that's not what's going on.
That makes a lot of sense. Great. What should a parent do if they suspect that the child has ADHD?
The first thing to do is to visit your pediatrician, because a lot of different physiological things can mimic ADHD, and it's really important to rule those things out before just jumping to the conclusion that your child has ADHD. And some of those things are things like a sleep disorder. You might not even know that your child has sleep apnea, food allergies, depression, anxiety, experiencing a level of trauma. So there are other things that could be going on, and it's important to really understand.
Right. I see.
Then if you rule everything out, your pediatrician will likely give you a screening tool, which is a questionnaire that a parent and a teacher will fill out. And if you meet, you check off enough boxes, the pediatrician can give that diagnosis. At that point, you have, a couple of different options. One, if there's a level of impairment happening at school where learning is being impacted, you can ask the school to do an evaluation. And if you have the means, you can get a licensed psychologist to do a neuropsychological evaluation, which I highly recommend if that's something that you can do. It breaks all of the processes down. And so that even if you get the diagnosis of ADHD, this gives you a much better picture of really what's happening behind that diagnosis. Is it an auditory processing problem, a visual processing problem? Is it a working memory issue? It's just a lot more information.
So any of those can be the underlying cause?
Well, the underlying cause, we don't really know. We know that it's partially that there's a very high genetic factor, but it can also be a function of environment, not parenting environment. I don't mean that, but I mean, it could be something that happened at birth that that causes the symptoms. But no, what I mean is that ADHD, even though it's not called a spectrum disorder, because there are 18 different symptoms and you could have any combination of them, it's going to present differently for everyone. And one child might have really, really awful working memory. Another child might have terrible auditory processing. And those might be the underlying what's feeding the behavior, feeding the symptoms that are most obvious.
I see. So it sounds like with those symptoms, then this could be really highly comorbid with like dyslexia or dyscalculia or any of those things. Is that correct?
Yeah, ADHD can be comorbid with a whole host of things, including autism spectrum disorder, anxiety, but also, yes, very highly correlated with a learning disability.
So would they always have a learning disorder?
No, they don't always have a learning disability. So you might have a child with hyperactive ADHD who's a whippersnapper in school, who learns to read really quickly, great at math. Their main problem is they just don't pay attention. And so they miss material because they're not listening. But it's not a processing issue. It's not there's nothing technically happening that's impeding their ability to learn to read, for example. And so that child would not qualify for special education under a specific learning disability. They would qualify, if they did, under other health impaired.
Okay, so I hear that type of child, you hear the parents sometimes say, my child is just bored in school and that's why they acted. Is that kind of that child that you're describing there?
Well, that child isn't getting dopamine to the prefrontal cortex.
So bored.
And that dopamine allows someone to pay attention when the material is boring to them.
Okay.
And so, yes, that technically they might just be bored in school, whereas, the kid who sits next to him is also bored, but still can push through and pay attention.
Okay. Okay. So what type of therapy is best for a child with ADHD?
Well, the CDC recommends for young children in particular that the first line therapy is parent behavior training, because the parent is with the child most, and young children don't really have the cognitive ability to access therapy, remember what they're supposed to do, and really generalize an hour of therapy a week into their life, especially when they're experiencing a disorder that impacts inhibition control.
Sure.
Then, beyond that, there's the most research, of course, has been done on medication. Medication is a highly, highly personal choice, and one that should be just thoroughly discussed with your pediatrician or a psychiatrist, because everyone feels differently about it. But the general first line protocol would be a combination of behavior therapy and medication. That's what they've found to be most impactful.
Okay.
Beyond that, there have been a lot of studies done on things like martial arts, and that actually has been shown to help. Yoga has been shown to help, mindfulness practice. Things we don't have a lot of evidence on are, but that you'll hear a lot about are food dyes having a big impact. And we don't have a lot of studies to show that that's
really okay.
That that's actually having that kind of an impact.
That's almost one of those things that seems accepted that that's to be true. And
if you have a child who reacts to a food dye, you will swear up and down that that's what's going on, and it might be for your particular child, but across the board, they haven't been able to to do a study that really shows that that's what has an impact on all ADHD behaviors.
Interesting. What is parental behavior training?
Well, it's very, very specific to that particular family, because there are a lot of factors involved in what they might need, including does this child have a comorbid learning disorder or depression and anxiety? Are there siblings in the household? Are they younger or older? Has the child been diagnosed, and for how long? Is the child aware of their diagnosis? Things like that. And then beyond that, what are the particular behaviors that are causing the most impairment, not only in school, but also with the family dynamics? And then we just start to attack those one by one. And the first thing we look at is how is the parent reacting to those behaviors?
Sure. All right.
Because 9 times out of 10, the reaction is one that you might give to a neurotypical child that ought to, quote unquote, know better. And it's just not a helpful reaction for a child with an impulse control disorder, because they couldn't control what they did.
Mm-hmm.
So asking them to not do it again or punish them because of something they did generally just won't have an impact. And so the parent and child wind up getting more and more and more frustrated.
Okay. So is this a form of therapy or more education?
I really like to call it more training. It's
Okay.
not therapy. Therapy is working more on your emotional side, and
Mm-hmm.
this really is more specific to, okay, let's problem solve. Let's look at, what are you doing and how can you do it differently to get a different outcome.
Finding what works.
Mhm.
Okay. Why would it not work? Could get in the way of
Unfortunately, um, parenting a child with ADHD in particular is exhausting.
okay.
It takes a lot of forethought, a lot of what I call preventative parenting,
Okay.
where you're having to be 2 steps ahead of your child and really thinking about, okay, we're going to a barbecue on Sunday. It's at 1:30. My child might be really tired because that's when they nap, or my child
Mm-hmm.
might be really hungry and hate the food at the barbecue, like just really, really thinking ahead. Or maybe even deciding barbecues just aren't in our future at the moment.
Right. Okay.
Um, and a lot of parents are in a state of denial. They don't want their lives to be impacted like that. They want to go to that barbecue, and they want their child to just do what they're told.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so they will fight the fact that actually they're the ones that have to change first.
I see.
Um, and change is difficult. You're
Yes.
um, often this isn't the road that they thought they would be on. It's not what they signed up for. Um, there are a lot of parents that just really wish somebody could work with their child and change their child. Um, and
Uh-huh.
yeah, and it just, unfortunately, it's not that easy.
Yeah. When we shut down, we ran our kung fu school for 20 years, and it was really uh, we hated to shut it down, but we had to. And a few parents came to us and said, "Who will discipline my child now?" And I mean, I just we had no answer. We didn't know what to. So I would have given them your number.
Oh gosh, yeah. No, I've been there. I have 2 of my 3 have ADHD, and I remember those years, and they were not easy or fun. It's really hard, and most people who don't have kids with issues don't understand how hard it is either.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Parents will frequently have a sense of some kind of parenting failure. Like, if I had only done something differently,
Right.
my child would be different. Or shame. I can't bring my kid to a barbecue because he's probably going to have a meltdown and crawl under the table. Um,
Right.
and
Are,
and there's a lot of judgment by people who don't understand. Why can't your child behave? Why? Gosh, this child
are,
just needs some discipline.
yeah. So you mentioned several emotions. Are there like stages of those emotions that they will go through? Is there
Absolutely.
grief?
It's very similar to the stages of grief, because in fact what they're grieving is the
Mhm.
parenting experience they thought they were going to have.
Right. That's exactly where I was
Um,
going. Yeah. Right.
yeah, yeah. So, there's denial and anger and yeah, and sadness and everything that you might feel when you're grieving something.
Right. So the parents may need therapy at that point, right? They're
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, just because you might be getting parent behavior training so that you can help your child doesn't mean that you shouldn't think about getting some just straight on therapy for yourself as well, because
Mm-hmm.
those are some really big feelings. And then people will feel guilt because they feel that way, right? It's like I'm supposed to just unconditionally love my child.
It's
I
true.
have a lot of parents that when I give them permission or I voice in the room that it's possible you might not like your child, then, they'll just erupt sobbing because it's true and they've held that in and it's embarrassing and they feel terrible, but it's true. They love their child, but they don't always like their child.
Yes, yes, very understandable. Wow. Okay. So I've got a couple of questions here let me put these in context. They're from a friend of mine who has a child who is, I think he's probably 20, 21, inattentive ADHD.
Hmm.
Very late diagnosed. I'm not sure when, but maybe just recently. Went off to college. It didn't go so well, and he's now dropped out. And so these are questions from her. And she says, what are some practical ways for individuals with inattentive ADD to motivate themselves and deal with changing their entrenched behaviors after diagnosis? So this is an older child.
Okay, so there are two things well, more than two things to consider, but because of the late diagnosis, this now adult is likely to have a lot of self-esteem issues, right? That they've been struggling for years and years and years with no understanding of why can't I do what seems to come so easily to everybody else? And they've been, just continually labeled as forgetful or you're not trying hard enough.
Mm-hmm.
And they haven't had the benefit of any type of training to understand, well, sure, this doesn't come easily to me, but these are the 5 things I need to do in order to succeed. I need to use my agenda or my iPhone in a totally different way than anyone else. I need to set reminders. I need to put my keys in the same place all the time. Just little tips and tricks. They don't have those. The second thing to consider is, in order for someone with ADHD to really achieve like a greater success, the best path for them is one where they're passionate, because that passion will create dopamine, which will always help their prefrontal cortex. So if you love to dance, but you are a finance and accounting major because your parents think that that's, going to be a better breadwinner, you're not likely going to succeed in that, and you probably will drop out, and then you won't earn anything.
Mm-hmm.
So really drilling down and understanding, what are this person's interests, and is there a way for them to go down that path instead of this? Well, I got to go to college and I got to study, psychology because that's what I'm expected to study. Then if you can garner a level of excitement for whatever that path is, I would highly recommend, if someone has the financial wherewithal, to hire a coach, an ADHD adult coach. An ADHD coach, it's not a once a week session. It doesn't work. This person usually will be more of a daily, like 15-minute check-in, or sometimes even a text kind of relationship. But that person with ADHD needs what we call a scaffold. They
Mm-hmm.
need, until they learn those skills we talked about in point number 1, they need someone on the outside kind of doing those skills for them and reminding them of those skills constantly and really reinforcing that behavior until they can leave the bird's nest on their own.
Right. Okay. So it's a behavioral training thing. So yeah, that's fantastic. Okay. So the second question she asks is, practically speaking, such a low percentage of those with ADHD and ADHD are able to finish a traditional college education. So is it practical for them to even embark on it?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that I would agree with the low percentage
Okay.
finishing.
Good,
school.
good,
I think
good.
it really is a question of, are they in school for something they're interested in? A lot of children with ADHD will absolutely thrive in college because this is the first time they can choose their classes. They're not stuck
Mhm.
in high school just for, a dreary 8 hours being taught things they're not interested in. Um, so the question really is, are they able to major in something that lights their fire?
Right.
And if not, then, maybe it's okay to look at something else. Maybe this person would rather be a masseuse or, a barber or
Right.
just, something that just really interests them.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Very good. I do hear in the entrepreneurial world a lot of entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, claiming that their ADHD is the source of their success in a way.
Well, yeah, the thing about people with ADHD and autism also is their ability to hyper focus.
Yes.
So when they're interested in something, then they can just lock onto that and do it for hours on end. And so a lot of parents will say, "My child can't have attention deficit disorder. He or she can sit at a Lego table for hours on end or play video games for hours on end. There's no attention deficit there at all." But they're just misunderstanding that it's the attention required when something is boring.
Hmm.
That that's where the deficit is.
Okay. So if they have a passion, then they'll have incredible
Yeah.
attention.
Yeah.
That answers a lot of questions about some of my students. Okay. Very good. Huh. Okay. So then, as an adult diagnosed, what's the best way to overcome the emotional trauma from not having a diagnosis until adulthood?
Well, I would send you to a therapist for that one because emotional trauma is usually best dealt with in the hands of somebody who knows what they're doing.
Okay.
And there really is a certain amount of emotional trauma, although we use the word trauma very lightly these days. Um,
Hmm.
but to a degree, you've had a lifetime of thinking that you're a failure when that's really not the case at all. It's just a question of your brain functioning differently from other people's. I often like to use the analogy that everyone around you just seems to know how to naturally speak Chinese. And you're being asked to speak Chinese and no one's bothering to teach it to you. And they're getting increasingly frustrated with you that you're not speaking it. And you start to feel like, well, I should be able to speak it. Everyone else can.
Yeah.
Um, so as an adult, you've had years and years and years of that feeling. So I would say go to a therapist to deal with the emotions, but find an ADHD coach, somebody who can really look at, well, what is your particular struggle? Is it time management? Or is it forgetfulness? And there are so many tips and tricks that you can work on. And if a coach is too expensive, there's so many books as well. So
Okay.
there's a lot of self-help out
Okay.
there.
Great. Let's jump to, you touched before on sensory input, and again, can you mention what role do you think sensory input plays in ADHD, or just the ability to focus?
So sensory input is going to be one of those things that some children with ADHD have and others might not. And so, if you have a child who absolutely hates certain noises or sights or textures,
Mhm.
the feel of some types of food in their mouth, then those aren't children that are just being difficult. Those are children that have sensory issues, and they're very, very real to those children. Those
Sure. Hmm.
sensory issues can make you feel like you want to crawl out of your own skin and you can't
Hmm.
get away. Um, so they're not going to impact every child, but some children will have them, and it absolutely can be something else that just gets in the way of learning. If you're bothered by your underwear tag, how are you supposed to pay attention in school all day when this is something that's just making you, want to get out of your own body?
Right, right. How about balance as a sensory input?
Again, I do know that there are some children that have balance issues or have fine motor problems or gross motor problems. It's definitely not across the board.
Hmm.
There have been you're probably familiar with some treatment facilities that open up that work on those kind of balancing issues.
Yeah.
Mm. I'm not aware of any particular studies that show that will be any kind of a cure-all, but there are a lot of parents that feel for their children with balance issues that it's very helpful for
Right.
them.
I know as a martial artist, one of the tricks that we do as a fighting trick is that we learn to can absolutely control another person's balance, and it actually shuts off their brain. They can't do anything because you've gone into a system one brain function, and there's so much cognitive processing needed to maintain balance. And so on the other side of that, we develop our own balance. And I've seen a lot of kids with different learning disabilities just by developing balance and learning proprioception. Seems to have a pretty big effect. I know that there's one researcher who talks about vestibular input as a cause for like dyslexia and things. I don't know that that's 100% true, but I think that there's some lines of thought there.
Yeah, and in addition to martial arts, I personally, my daughter was a horseback rider, my daughter with ADHD.
Hmm.
And, it's a similar type of balancing side to side
Yes.
impact on the body, so there are a lot of people that also believe that something like that can be super helpful. So again, yeah, if that's something that is challenging for your child,
Uh-huh.
um, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of our understanding between what we do with our bodies and how that impacts the areas of our brain that um,
Yeah, yeah. That was actually somewhere I was going to go with that because I noticed you have a horse on your website, Bo.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so in martial arts, our primary stance is called a horse stance or a horse riding stance, and it feels exact. I grew up riding horses, Western style. I
Okay.
have no clue if it's when it comes to English, but I did ride Western style every day of my life from age like 7 on. So, and the feeling of the stance in martial arts is exactly the same in our martial art. We're pushing the heels out, we're pushing the heels down, and of course you're posting. There's a huge crossover. So on your website, you did mention different types of mind-body exercises, and I was going to mention that I would actually consider horseback riding one of those.
Yeah.
One thing, and going back to balance, most people consider the vestibular input as your primary source of balance, and maybe the secondary source as your vision, your sense of the horizon. And I would argue that your feeling in your feet is actually should be your primary source of balance. And of course, that's what horseback is going to train. Horseback riding is going to train that and really develop that. And since I think that if there is a little bit of balance off, that it can so quickly override the brain and lose attention that maybe there's something to look at there. Maybe you were inadvertently helping your daughter out by the horseback riding.
Right. I know we lucked out with that one. We tried martial arts with her. She didn't. It
Yeah,
wasn't.
yeah, that's a deep subject. There are a lot of different martial arts out there, and I don't see all of them as having the same benefits as that. So it's the very unfortunate thing is martial arts has become a sport in the United States,
Mm,
and it's not a sport; it's a discipline. So
right.
and that changes just everything in the way it's taught. So anyway, so tell me about mind body in general and how that plays a role in focus and learning.
Well, back to
or,
your
or
to your
mindfulness.
yeah, to your point about balancing, whether strengthening a person's ability to balance is what ultimately overcomes their learning issue or not.
I think it's one component. I wasn't trying to claim that it was everything.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm saying it could. We just don't. I don't really know. But what I do know is that that type of training, that type of whether it's a martial art or yoga or horseback riding, does allow these children an opportunity to really feel their body in space when they might not otherwise
Right.
even think about it. A lot of these children do have visual spatial processing issues and
Yes.
a lot of difficulty controlling their bodies. My oldest daughter would sometimes fall down from a simple standing position just out of nowhere. It's like, wonder how on earth you would do that.
Yeah.
And so it brings a mindfulness to sensations in their own body and an awareness of like, oh, well, when my tummy starts to feel this way, that means I'm about to get really nervous. Or when my neck feels this way, it means I'm probably going to get mad. And well, it's so difficult for young children in particular to control their impulses. Having that greater sense of the body, anyway, at least starts to move them in that direction.
Right. Yeah, we've seen a lot of progress with proprioception, and my wife and I, having taught the martial arts for 20 years, and not just a normal martial arts school, one that was completely full of kids with autism and ADHD and everything, that we could actually look, and I think, at a person's body motion, the way they move the body when they learned. And I mean, we weren't diagnosing, but we were dead on when we said, hey, this one's got this and this one's got that. And I think I mentioned in an email to you that yesterday we attended UC Berkeley for graduation.
Right. That's congrats.
Yeah, that young man came to us. He was Asperger's. He was violent. He was antisocial. He would throw chairs at his teachers in school.
Throwing chairs, that's a common one.
Is it? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But he did bring himself into our classes. He did it on his own. He wanted to change. And, he had the same thing we saw with all Asperger's, that they had no, we tell them to move their right hand and their left foot would move. And there's this jerky, it's just a jerky motion that they have. And it's really strange that we correlate as his motion developed, his Asperger's symptoms seemed to fade away. And this was a kid that was going to be put in a group home.
Wow.
And yesterday graduated UC Berkeley. And
That's
he's
phenomenal. That's really wonderful.
Yeah, so it's just really amazing to see and fulfilling to see. And you mentioned the visual-spatial. So the visual-spatial happens in the hippocampus, and of course that is where the logical thinking, it starts and sends it to the BFC too. So there seems to be some relationship there.
I'm sure there is. No, so as I mentioned, the first step towards inhibiting a behavior is even being aware that you are about to do it in the first place.
Right.
And that's the biggest challenge. Is most of the time this behavior occurs before the child even is aware that it's about to occur, and and then they get yelled at for something and they don't even remember doing it or why they did it. So talking to the child about, well, what was going on for you right before you did that? How did your body feel in that moment?
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry, I had a lot of those talks with this young man through his development, because he would claim, oh, I'm Asperger's, I don't have emotions. And I go, yes, you do. Just find them, and so yeah, all of those things, that's fantastic. So but it roots in the mind-body awareness, and then that allows them to find how those emotions feel. Is that what we're...
Right, exactly. So always, not just talking about emotions, but talking about how did the body feel when you had that emotion. One thing I like to suggest for parents that have children that get emotionally dysregulated a lot, because that's a very big one with ADHD and autism as well, is to create what we call a sensory box. And so it's a box filled with objects that relate to all of the senses. So it might be, something that feels really nice, something that's joyful to look at, something that smells nice, something that has a nice sound to it if you move it, but that the child picks themselves. So they're helping to create this sensory box. And whenever they experience a really big emotion, it's something they can go to. Hey, I see that you're really upset right now. Maybe it's time to pull out the sensory box and have a little chill out time. And so it's an opportunity for the child to learn how to regulate themselves without just being told to go to your room for a timeout.
Excellent. Right. I see lots of examples of sensory boxes on Pinterest. So if you search on Pinterest for that, you'll thousands and thousands of results. So that's
great. Okay.
Popular. Yeah. So the prefrontal cortex, which you talked about in the beginning. Now, I know that us poor guys, we don't get ours developed fully until we're like 27. Is that right?
Not just men. It's, humans.
Is it humans, really?
It's humans, yeah.
So all humans, the PFC is not fully developed until later. It's not just in the teens.
Right. It's sometime after age 25, and it's going to be different for everyone. And yes, it may mature faster in some women than in some men, but it's generally after.
But that's a fallacy that it's just men, huh? I did not know that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Really? Okay, I feel better then.
There you go.
So can ADHD fade as the PFC is more developed, or was it not every age?
Question. So what we see fading is the hyperactive piece. So generally, as children enter their teen years, that child that just could never sit still and was constantly making noises and had a whirling, twirling motor inside them, that motor will start to settle a little bit, and that energy might come out in other less large ways. Like maybe that's the person that's constantly bouncing their knee or drives a little too fast. So we do see that piece waning. What having a fully consolidated prefrontal cortex will do is allow you to have the fullest access to what yours is capable of, but it's not going to be the same or as functional as someone who's neurotypical at that age. So we don't all come together as one.
Okay. Right.
Prefrontal cortex skills. Okay. So you'll still have those struggles, but oftentimes, especially in someone that was diagnosed, by the time they're 25, they've figured things out. They understand, well, I have trouble with this, and I need to do the following things so that I can be equalized.
Okay, good. Let's talk a little bit about routine. Is it a tool for parents?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell how that helps?
Structure, structure can be beneficial for all children, really, because when you know what's expected of you, then it's much easier to perform if the target isn't always moving. And so for a child with ADHD in particular, who's more likely to forget, or they don't have the ability to listen to multi-step directions. If they know that everything is the same every day, and maybe there are visuals that have been set up, it's a picture of a child brushing their teeth, and that can be, they can go check that and see what's next on their list. Then it will just help everyone succeed. It also takes the pressure off the parent for constantly yelling what the next step is for the child, because it's predetermined. It's the same next step every day. So it just can help consolidate the learning and take the pressure off.
I see. Fantastic. Okay. Good. So it helps them focus on what they need to focus then, rather than constantly changes.
Yeah.
How important is a diagnosis? Should all parents who suspect look for a diagnosis?
I know there's a lot of fear about getting a diagnosis because people are afraid their child will be labeled for the rest of their life, by
Okay.
school and to a certain degree, sure, we can't help what other people are going to think or how they're going to judge. But I think that a diagnosis helps people to understand what's feeding the behavior, and in a way takes a little bit of the pressure off, because now we have an understanding, and now we know how we can treat. It's really hard to devise a good treatment if you don't understand what's causing the symptoms.
I see. Good. Okay, very good. Now, and tell us a little bit about your books.
Thank you for asking. So, the first book is a picture book, and it's generally for children 3 to 8 years old and to be read, with a parent typically. And it's about Charlie, who has a whirling, twirling motor. He has hyperactive ADHD, although we never come right out and say that in the story. It takes him through his day where his um, ADHD is just causing him to mess up, essentially. And he feels badly, and you can tell that he feels badly. Then at the end of the day, his mother tucks him in and tells him that she needs to talk to him, and he thinks he's about to get into trouble. And instead, she reads him his wonderful list. So it has a nice little twist of an ending, and is a little lesson. The
Very nice.
next book coming out is My Wandering Dreaming Mind, and it's a girl with inattentive ADHD whose daydreaming gets her into trouble all day long as well, until her mom has a nice surprise for her at the end. It's not the same as the wonderful list, but it's something that's feel good.
Very good. Very good. Okay. And one more very important question here. Why do you love dragonflies, sunflowers, and flying pigs?
Oh, those are testaments to my childhood. We
Okay.
had dragonflies in our yard. I grew up on the East Coast in Massachusetts, and we just had these massive dragonflies all over the yard. And
Mm-hmm.
um, and we had tall, tall sunflowers growing at the end of the driveway. And the flying pigs, that's way too long of the story to tell here, but it's a reminder of my dad, who
Okay.
passed away 10 years ago.
Okay. Well, I share your love of dragonflies and sunflowers. So for sure, I'm growing sunflowers now, and dragonflies
Oh,
flies are just amazing. I love to watch them. I can't imagine the speed of processing that they have to catch things in midair.
right.
They are the ultimate predator, is why I like them.
Our students could use a little bit of that processing, I bet.
Yes, yes. That's it. So, is there anything else that I have not asked that our listeners should know?
Only that I am happy to be of help to anybody that thinks that they could benefit. I work with a lot of people all over the country by phone or online,
Okay.
and I'm happy to even have a, a short call to see if I might be of assistance to anyone. So
So they don't have to be in your area. You can reach them through technology anywhere.
that's right. It's a wonderful thing.
It truly is. I actually teach Kung Fu online, and people call
Wow.
people call me crazy for doing that and saying it's impossible, but I can guarantee it is not. I have some amazing students online. So
That's so cool.
yeah, yeah, it is. We actually that when Google Hangouts on Air, which is what we're using right now, came out, we started it the next week. It was just like this is the technology we want.
Oh my gosh, that's fabulous. I
Yeah.
love to hear that.
Yeah, that's cool. So, and where can listeners find you? Your websites?
Merriamsaunders.com.
Okay.
And my contact information is there.
Okay, great. And we'll link that below. Very good. Well, thank you very much. This has been a very, very informative interview, and I learned a lot. And
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
all right, very good. Thank you.